good morning to all of you. You know, it's very difficult to put a Latin American on a podium with music and expect her not to start dancing. So I really had to control my instincts right now. Now, I must confess to you, every time I speak in public, there is a new challenge. One of the recent challenges that I had was I had the honor to interview in public Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple. And I started making, as I usually do, my little speaking notes on these primitive little pieces of paper. And my good colleague, Tom Carnig, who's sitting here this morning, said, "You really are not going to go in public and interview Tim Cook with little pieces of paper, are you?" And I said, "Oh, that's right. I should probably put my notes into my iPad." So I take out an iPad, and Tom says, "Yeah, but in that case, maybe it should be an iPad of this century and not of last century." So here we are, back with little pieces of paper. Now, the challenge today, my dear friends, is to speak here without turning my back to someone. Completely impossible. The only other time that I have seen this kind of a setup is when you have a concert, and at least you have the orchestra on one side, and then you have, of course, the director on the other side. So either you're facing the orchestra or you're enjoying the director. But when you have neither an orchestra nor a director, it's a little bit difficult. However, thank you very much, Philippe, for showing me how this is done, partly here, partly there. I shall attempt to follow your very good example. Let me thank Total University very much for this very kind invitation. I recently was honored by an honorary PhD degree from an American university, and when they offered to me, I said, wait, you mean I can get a PhD by just turning up and picking up my PhD? And they said, yeah, and I said, okay, fine, I'm there. Then when I got the invitation to come to Total University, I said, wait, you mean I can go to university in one day? Well, I'm there. That's a fantastic invention of Total. So thank you very much. I really commend the very, very interesting initiative. And I learned last night at a wonderful dinner that this is now a 10-year tradition at Total to have a university, a one-day university, sometime a two-day university, in which you bring in the voices from outside as a challenge to your own view of yourselves, which is a very healthy exercise that we in the Secretariat of Climate Change also attempt to do on a periodic basis. I would also like to congratulate Total for the 3 climate-related initiatives that were announced yesterday on carbon pricing, on methane flaring, and on clean air coalition. I saw it on my way here to Paris and immediately tweeted my support for Total having joined those three initiatives. Now, my friends, I think Philippe has done a fantastic job, and I really thank you for pointing out how the world is changing. And I would just like to add a couple of other examples about how the world truly is changing. The world is changing when one of the leading families of the world divests from fossil fuels. None other than the Rockefeller family. The world is changing when in my briefing book for my trip to China this week, the piece of analysis that has most depth and most credibility on the dramatic reduction of coal in China, the reduction of coal in China, is not a report written by the Chinese government or by the IEA. It's a report written by Greenpeace. The world is changing. The world is changing when in September of this year, in the United Nations in New York, you have 1,000 companies, 75 companies standing up and saying, we need a price on carbon. Those 1,000 companies and those 75 governments represent 50% of the world's population, 50% of GDP, and 50% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Not a bad start for a request on carbon pricing. The world is definitely changing when at that same meeting in New York, you see the CEO of one of the largest energy companies in the world stand up and say he knows that the world is moving toward low carbon and he is committed to putting his company on the same track. That CEO was not the CEO of Vestas, that was the CEO of Saudi Aramco. The world is changing from where we were, my friends, even just 5 years ago. An amazing, amazing transformation that is occurring right in front of us, right in front of us. Now, why is this change occurring? Well, I would say that fundamentally there are two factors, two driving forces of change. One is that there is an increasing appreciation of the very harsh reality of risk. Every day we see more analysis of the increasing risks with increasing delay of policy, increasing risks of climate change on all human endeavors, be they corporate, be they governmental, be they the person living on the beach, on the shore side and facing rising sea levels, be it the people in flood areas, be it gas infrastructure that is built on tundra. Whatever it is, there is more and more appreciation of the risks of climate. And secondly, there is more appreciation of the urgency to address climate change. It used to be that climate change was an environmental issue that need to be looked by the tree huggers. That's no longer the case. Now it is fundamentally, from your perspective, a corporate continuity challenge. That is a world changed. I'm sure you all know that the 5th assessment report of the IPCC, as Philippe has already pointed out, and the UNEP gap report that I just launched yesterday morning in Berlin, both of them come out with the same conclusion. And the conclusion is, we're not on a 2-degree path yet. We could be on a 2-degree path if we get our act together, and we're running out of time to get on the 2-degree path. And finally, and bottom line, in particular the UNEP gap report takes the numbers of the IPCC 5th assessment report and analyzes what does it mean to be on the 2-degree pathway. What it means, my friends, is actually a world completely transformed. Because what it takes to be on the 2-degree pathway is for the world as a whole to peak over the next 10 years globally, reach global peaking, then begin its decline in greenhouse gas emissions in order to reach climate neutrality in the second half of the century. What does climate neutrality mean? It's actually pretty simple. It is restoring the balance that we had before the Industrial Revolution. The balance between what we as human beings emit and what the Earth with its natural capacity can absorb. And that balance should give us net zero emissions, and that is where we have to be by the second half of the century. Now, I am the first to admit that is a tall order from where we stand right now, because I am the first one to witness that, in fact, we are still on a path of increasing greenhouse gases. So just the thought that we would have to be at climate neutrality 50, 60 years from now is actually a daunting thought, because immediately we human beings go, well, that's completely impossible. There's no way we're going to do that. There's no way we're going to do that. Well, I would also admit to putting a big question mark on how are we going to do that. I don't think there's anybody right now who can tell us how we're going to do that. But I am reminded, everybody here in the room is way too young to remember a mainframe computer. Don't raise your hands. The mainframe computers were not quite as large as this room, but let me say half as large as this room. When I went to school, when I went to university, I did my thesis on a mainframe computer. Here's how that worked for those of you who are way too young. All of you are way too young. When you worked on a mainframe computer, first of all, it was a whole building dedicated to the one computer that was available to the whole university. Secondly, you had to get an appointment with the computer to use it, which means it could work 24 hours, which is pretty good. But you had to set your alarm clock. And since I wasn't exactly organized as a student, I usually ended up setting my alarm clock at 3:30 in the morning because it's the only time that I could get an appointment with the computer to put in the little cards with my data points. That is what a mainframe computer was 35 years ago. Today, each one of us carries at least one or two tiny little computers in our back pocket that are 1,000 times more powerful than a mainframe computer, and that's just in 35 years. So if you had asked me, particularly at 3:30 in the morning when I wanted to throw my alarm clock into the river, if you had asked me, is it possible that within 35 years you no longer have to set your alarm clock because you're going to be carrying the little computer in your pocket, and you're going to be able to do that and many, many, many more things, everything in fact except cook dinner for tonight on your little computer, I would have said, frankly, completely impossible. And you see, my friends, that's where we are right now. That is where we are right now in the energy transformation. Understandably so, because we can only barely peek into the future. But I am here to tell you that that future is by now irreversible. We are definitely moving into a low carbon economy. And let me walk you very quickly through the international policy process because it is the one that gets most criticism. I am the first one to criticize it, but I'm also the first one to stand up for it because I think it is not the solution, but we're not going to get a solution without an international agreement here in this wonderful city in Paris next year. So quickly, a timeline of what we're doing there. I leave for Lima next week. On the 1st of December in Lima, Peru, the governments of the world, 194 governments of the world, are going to be looking for the first time at the draft agreement that is intended for Paris. 1 full year ahead of time, they already have the draft agreement in front of them. In fact, you can look at the draft agreement because it is a publicly accessible document on our website. So you can take a look at what is intended there. It is not clean, it is not final, it is not definitive, but it certainly is illustrative of what governments are looking at over the next 12 months. Then they will continue to refine that draft for several months next year, and in May of next year, I have the obligation of taking whatever document they have by then, translating it into 6 languages of the United Nations and sending it to the cabinets of every single one of the countries to be discussed. And they will have 6 months of tranquilidad, as I say in my native Spanish language, of calm consideration. This is not Copenhagen, okay? This is not 300 pages put in front of governments in the last minute. Here's your big fat red pen, Mr. President Obama, and you figure out what to do with this text. No. This is a very orderly process of deep consultation across sectors, nationally and internationally, that will then result in an agreement that will be adopted in Paris just a short year from now. In that context, let me take the very recent announcement from US and China, and I know that I'm slated to comment on it later, but instead of doing that now, I would rather comment on it now because I think it is so important. We all know what the US and China announced just 2 weeks ago, so the numbers are clear to us. Let me, and I'm sure that my colleagues from the United States and China will go through the numbers with you again after this. Let me take the qualitative, not the quantitative, but the qualitative meaning of that announcement between the United States and China, and let me look at it through 3 different lenses. Lens number 1, leadership. Leadership. Very impressive that the two largest economies of the world, the two highest emitters of the world, have decided that they are going to take the leadership. We perfectly well could have understood if China, for example, had said to the US, you go first and I will follow. Or the other way around, which is what many people in the United States want. But no, they both decided they will take the leadership. Very important to see that the United States and China are not only accepting a responsibility, but rather seeing this as a very important opportunity to modernize their energy systems, their transportation systems, and help to lead the way into the 21st century for their citizens. So leadership, number one. Second lens that we have to see it through, acceleration. You know, the fact is, neither the United States nor China had any need to make this announcement in this month. They perfectly well could have waited until March of next year, because that is when all governments are going to come forward with their national contributions. So they chose to do this 4 months ahead of time. Acceleration, not just of their commitments, but actually even in the announcements that they make it very clear that while they're putting out a target, China for peaking and the United States for reduction, both of them are fully intending to accelerate the pace of that action and reach those targets ahead of time. Acceleration. And the third lens that I would like to look at it through is cooperation. Two rivals, if you will, two rivals coming out to say, you know what, not only do we have to do this individually, but we stand better chances of doing it together and cooperating. A very interesting example of what Tom Friedman calls the most amazing frenemies that ever were, because Tom Friedman knows that China and the United States are both friends and enemies. So he created this fantastic word, frenemies, right? But on climate change, they have agreed to work together, because they can do some things at home individually, but they can do much more if they collaborate with each other. So I would like to take those three lenses to now turn around and say, what can we learn from the United States and China in terms of leadership, in terms of acceleration, and in terms of cooperation that might be helpful for what we should be addressing and are addressing here today. First, leadership. Here I would like to emphasize and thank Philippe also for spelling out so clearly the leadership that Total has already taken in this field. And I actually think that there's one more example, which is your investment with Masdar in 100 megawatts in UAE in the Sham solar plant. A very impressive plant, but also the investment of Total in blah blah, so many of the other things, Philippe, that you pointed out. For Total specifically, already showing leadership. And then the United States, you know, how many of us know that actually the oil and gas companies in the United States have collectively already invested $9 billion into renewable energy, which is the equivalent of 1/5 of the total investment in the United States. So clearly, leadership on the part of the oil and gas industry. Now, my question, because you know I am both impatient and insatiable in my need for progress, my question that I would like to leave you with is that enough leadership? Is that enough? Because frankly, one thing that we can consider is, what is the metric? Is the metric increase in the efficiency of operations, or is the metric actually the creation of new sources of revenue, new sources of income, with the examples that Philippe was already giving? I would pose to you that the transformation that is necessary from the oil and gas industry is one not of increasing operations only. That has to be and is very helpful and is definitely the first step. But the second step then is the identification of new revenue sources, the creation of a new business model, of new goods, of new services that will actually make the company continue to be profitable in the new economy that is being created. Through the lens of acceleration, I pose to you that with the science results that we have on the table right now, the time for marginal changes is past. I pose to you that if we know that the price of oil will continue to be volatile, if we know that the cost of exploring oil will continue to increase, if we know that the clean energy technologies are accelerating and that their cost is decreasing, making them increasingly competitive with fossil fuels in many jurisdictions, then I pose to you that what we're faced here is the recognition that the pace of risk has truly accelerated. Not just the physical risk to installations, in particular in very vulnerable areas, but perhaps most fundamentally, the financial risk to investor long-term confidence. And so that if the pace of risk has increased, well then of course the response has got to be that risk management, where oil and gas industry is absolutely cutting edge on risk management, then the pace of risk management must also increase, not out of ideology, but rather out of a sense of business continuity and profitability in the long term. And the third lens, and the final, is cooperation. What does that mean? What does cooperation mean from the perspective of Total, from the perspective of the oil and gas industry? Well, I pose to you that this actually means taking the leadership that Total has already demonstrated in the oil and gas climate initiative that was announced, and where I'm very much looking forward to seeing what Total and the other companies are going to announce in Davos this year, building on that platform already of cooperation to raise our gaze, raise our sight to where are we going to be in 50 years. My father always told me, keep your feet on the ground, but your eyes on the stars. I certainly know that Total and the oil industry have your feet on the ground, and that's a very good thing. But now the question is, can you also put your eyes on the stars? Can you also, in collaboration with the other companies in the sector, initiate a big conversation, where is the oil and gas industry going to be 50 years from now? We're currently in the mainframe era, if we were talking about computers. Where are we going to be 50 years from now? What is the change from the mainframe to our tiny little iPhones? That's the transformation. What does that mean for the oil and gas industry? 50 years from now, what are we going to be looking at? What kinds of reports are we going to be reading? How are we going to be judging our profitability? That's a tall order, but that is leadership. That is cooperation, if you do it with all of the companies together. And from what Philippe said this morning, and thank you for educating me, I surmise that Total is already peeking into that future. You've already opened up a little window and going, what could this mean for us? So my invitation is to open up the window farther and invite the other companies of the oil and gas industry to a big conversation. Because this transformation is in part going to be done company by company, but also it is going to be done as a societal leap. As a society, we are leaping into low carbon, and we must all do our part. We must all collaborate. And I have placed that challenge here in front of you for one simple reason, because I am confident that Total is not only committed to better energy, but that Total is also committed to a better world. Thank you.